This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, begins the show with an update on the Swampbuster Act and what impactful cases are currently taking place. K-State's Glynn, Tonsor, and Joe Parcell continue today's show as they talk about the value of USDA reports and what they are doing to figure out worthwhile reports to continue to be produced. The show winds down with K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Eduarda Bortoluzzi with another segment from the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast discussing management techniques for twin beef calves. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show talking about the Swampbuster Act. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Shelby.
Roger, you recently wrote a blog article titled, "What's Going On with Swampbuster?" And before we talk about what's currently taking place around it, first a little bit of history and how did this concept get started?
Well, Swampbuster came in with the 1985 Farm Bill that had all the conservation cross-compliance provisions in it. And it came in as well with Sodbuster. Those were two of the major programs that were put in 85, as well as the Conservation Reserve Program. So a lot of conservation-type provisions that were included in the 1985 Farm Bill. And what it says basically is that you're not going to receive and be eligible for federal farm program payments if you drain land that is deemed to be a wetland, in accordance with the USDA rules, to produce an agricultural crop on it. So that's the basics of what Swampbuster is and where it came from.
What is distinguished as a wetland?
Well, initially, there were some interim rules that were put out in June of 1986, and wetland under those rules was assumed to be truly wet ground that had never been farmed. And there had to be an obligation of funds, such as an assessment paid to a drainage district that would qualify it as a commenced conversion. And so, therefore, if it had already been commenced in terms of being converted from a wetland to cropland prior to the effective date of the 1985 Farm Bill, you could still farm that and participate in the federal farm programs. Final rules came out in 1987. They were vastly different than the interim rules, and basically a lot more restrictive with respect to the application of the rules to farmers. You couldn't keep certain land in production that you could have under the interim rules, the way the final rules were written. And there were a lot of different aspects to that, but basically the rules became much tighter under the final rules.
And did the difference between the interim rules and final rules really make a big impact for producers?
Yeah, they did, and I think probably the biggest impact had to do with prior converted wetlands. They can be farmed, but they revert to their protected status once they were abandoned, and abandonment could occur after 5 years of inactivity and could have happened even in 1 year if there was an intent to abandon. And so under the final rules, a prior converted wetland, which means you're not subject to the Swampbuster rules, is a wetland that was totally drained before December 23, 1985. That's the effective date of the 1985 Farm Bill. And it's a wetland that is manipulated for the purpose or with the effect of making production of an ag commodity possible if that production would not have been possible but for the drainage activity. So the other problem that the final rules gave us was the concept of a farmed wetland, and that's a wetland that was drained before the 85 Farm Bill took effect, but still had wetland characteristics that remained. If that's the situation, then only the original drainage could be maintained. Now, once those rules came out, Shelby, we've had a lot of litigation on a whole host of issues with respect to Swampbuster. So it's been kind of a minefield for attorneys that practice in that area of the law, which is the case anytime you have a government program with rules associated with it. The question is whether you qualify for an exemption under the rules or whether the rules actually apply to you or not.
And a provision that also came with the Swampbuster Act, the Grassley Amendment?
Well, it didn't come exactly with the 85 Farm Bill. This one came in 1990 as an amendment to the Swampbuster rules. And it provided a review provision specifying that a prior wetland certification was to remain valid and in effect until such time as the person affected by the certification, which would be a farmer, requests review of the certification by the Secretary. That's what the Grassley Amendment said. It was named after Senator Grassley of Iowa, who is still there, by the way. So the purpose of the amendment was to prevent farmers from being subjected to multiple certifications based on new methods that at the time NRCS had started using to make wetland determinations, such as aerial photographs to make a wetland determination. And under the rule, a farmer could request a recertification. They could ask the NRCS to come out and make a recertification of a prior certification to see if things had changed and whether a wetland was no longer a wetland. Now, what happened was, of course, NRCS wrote regulations to carry out that statute. And they said, well, yeah, it says a farmer can get a recertification upon request, but we can't do all of those upon demand like that. So we're going to put the burden on the farmer to say that, well, yes, we'll come out and recertify, but only if a natural event altered the topography or the hydrology of the land, or if NRCS believed that the existing certification was erroneous. That then got into a court case. And that court case is presently sitting at the Supreme Court waiting for them to decide whether they're going to hear it.
And that case called the Foster case, and kind of what heartache did that family and that operation feel with this?
Well, this is the Foster case comes from southeast South Dakota, and this involves an 0.8 of an acre portion of a field that USDA certified as a wetland in 2011 under the Swampbuster provisions. And the wet area, when it had water in it, was about 8.5 inches deep at certain times of the year. Now, the interesting thing about this was that the wetland resulted, or the supposed wetland, I should say, resulted from a tree belt that had been planted in 1936 by Foster's predecessors to prevent soil erosion. So it's caused by trees that were planted to preserve the soil. Well, the snow in South Dakota accumulated around the tree belt in the winter. It melted in the spring, and sometimes you'd have water that would collect in a low spot in the field without any drainage. It would have to soak into the ground or evaporate, and that happened about half the time, and it would dry out in time for planting. In other years, it had to be drained to plant crops. Well, Foster wanted a review of the certification that USDA had done or NRCS had done, and they basically, in essence, there were some machinations, but they refused to do that. And he again sought review of the certification in 2017, and USDA NRCS didn't respond that time on the basis that he didn't provide any new information. Well, his argument was, I don't have to do this. This is not required by the statute. The statute says I have a right to request certification. You have to do it. And the USDA was saying, but we wrote regs that say that you have to show changed circumstances or that we made a mistake. And you can do that, so we're going to ignore you. So that's how this ended up in court. So far, he has lost, and the lower courts have said that the agency's rule writing was within their purview. So they gave them deference on that. And this case currently is sitting there on a request for the U.S. Supreme Court to hear it. And at their conference in January, the U.S. Supreme Court didn't do anything with this case. They didn't say yay or nay. And I think they're holding it, Shelby, until they decide two major cases involving agency deference that they will decide probably in June. So after that, if they lower the deferential standard given to federal government administrative agencies, then I think they will hear the Foster case, and we will get a ruling on the Grassley Amendment. If they go the other way, then we won't hear the Foster case. At least that's how I read the tea leaves right now.
And Roger, there is another case that was recently filed involving the Swampbuster Act as well.
Yeah, this one was filed in Iowa in mid-April, and this is a frontal challenge, a frontal assault on the constitutionality of the Swampbuster program as a whole. There are really 5 claims in the case. One, that it violates the Congress's power under the Commerce Clause because the 9-acre wetland in that case is purely inside the state of Iowa and has no connection to interstate waters at all. And so there's no interstate commerce that's involved. Therefore, the Commerce Clause does not invoke congressional power, and the act is unconstitutional as a result of that. Also, they're claiming that the Swampbuster rules impose unconstitutional conditions by conditioning a government benefit on the waiver of a constitutional right. They also say that it amounts to a taking of their private property in violation of the Constitution that the government has to pay for by granting the government a permanent conservation easement over their 9 acres without paying for it, and that the Swampbuster regulations exceed the authority that NRCS has as a government agency by adding what's called woody vegetation to the statutory definition of converted wetlands. And then finally, they say that the regulations exceed the agency's statutory authority and by doing so violate that Grassley Amendment. So this is a second case that also involves a claim involving the Grassley Amendment.
Is this something then that hopefully we'll get answers to what people are feeling on the Swampbuster Act by the end of 2024?
Well, we'll see. We may have a trial court decision by the end of 2024, but I would imagine whatever side loses will appeal it, and then it would go on to the 8th Circuit, and we could be easily into 2025 or 2026. If it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, we could easily be into 2027 by then. And
Roger, always wanting to remind people where they could read more on this topic.
I have an article on this posted on my blog, which can be accessed through my homepage, which is Washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. It can also be found on the AgManager website through the Department of Ag Econ at K-State.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an update on the Swampbuster Act.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn Law Professor Roger McEowen. I will link his blog article titled What's Going On with Swampbuster in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about how reports from the USDA are done. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor and director of the Center for Risk Management at K-State, Joe Parcell. Glynn, Joe, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks, Shelby.
As we're talking about agriculture, you two both put out a ton of different reports talking about things within it. And why is that data and information collection so important?
So I'll remind our listeners that we live in a world where there is a lot of information available. We need to back up and understand kind of where it comes from, what the raw data underneath that information is. And in the agriculture space, USDA, so United States Department of Agriculture, is probably the most prevalent source of that information that most of our listeners here, that would be, crop, livestock producers and the like, other stakeholders, benefit from. And there's a long history to that. I mean, USDA's been around for a long time. Joe and I, in the last several years, and we're going to talk narrowly here in a moment, but have engaged with USDA to hopefully help them understand and evaluate what they do, maybe make some of those reports better. But at the end of the day, the real simple thing to kind of kick off our discussion would be is USDA puts out a lot of reports that are publicly available that are the result of analysis built upon raw data that's often collected from producers to start with. So, maybe it's a cattle producer filling out a survey in lots of counties here in Kansas and then done around the country, and then USDA aggregates it up and puts out a report. Just use a cattle example there. That's not new, but the nature of the cattle industry, the nature of the hog industry, the nature of the specialty crop industry, lots of industries has changed over time. And periodically, USDA also backs up and evaluates, tries to improve what they're doing. And that's why we're here to talk today.
Yeah, Shelby, I'll just dovetail on what Glynn said there and just, give the listeners a little bit of history here. The one they're probably most familiar with is the Sense of Ag, and that's been around for 150 or so years. And, that's something that's mandated by Congress that we do every 5 years and keep track of. But, there's a lot of other data and information we've collected over the time because the industry's changed, as Glynn mentioned there. And it's really been in the last 50 years where we've really seen this breadth of data collection and then how we report out that data. And you might say, well, why do we collect all this data? Why do we do this analysis? Why are we always trying to figure out why to do it? Well, it kind of comes down to two different issues here. One is, what is our policy of the past tell us? How has it performed? How are we tracking? And what policies do we need to think about in the future? The other part of this is just how we do commerce, and that's business. And in agriculture, that really gets down to how do we discover prices and how do we do transactions there? And what it boils down to within this data and information is, as agriculture has become more global, as we look at more enterprises, at the same time maybe the number of farms has decreased, we have more things we're tracking further in the food chain or supply chain there, and then globally. And it's not a bottomless pit when it comes to funding. So what information are we going to collect? How are we going to report it? And how do we level the playing field out there that everybody that has access to this gets the same story?
I want to highlight and emphasize, Joe made the comment, more things we're tracking. For our listeners, not all cattle are equal. Not all hogs are equal. Not all pork's equal. Not all, corn's equal. You can keep going with all this. Is once upon a time, it was very almost exclusively a commodity world that USDA worked on. And, we're going to talk about some cattle and, swine aspects here in a moment to give you examples. But almost all industries in the U.S. that USDA is involved with are more differentiated. There's more attributes being, talked about. So my comment about not all cattle are equal is reality in the industry. And that has real implications for how USDA collects data and what they can do with it and kind of the market needs, right? So if you're raising cattle with a different production claim, so for example, just use an example here, is if it's non-hormone treated. Well, at some level, we need to gather the data that takes into account whether it's non-hormone treated or not and account for that. And that's a legit reason why the price on those cattle tends to be higher, because the cost of producing it is higher, right? So there's a lot of those examples. I'm giving you a specific one so our listeners can follow here. But USDA's raw data collection mechanisms have to be evaluated to kind of keep up with that. Once upon a time, we didn't track NHTC as an example. And then what do you do with it when you get a critical mass of a number of people that are making that particular, commerce decision, and how do we report it out? So there's a lot of those examples, because not all steers are equal, not all barrows are equal, and so forth.
Really then taking a look at how the industry is changing and then seeing how reporting can also change with it to be the most effective. Yeah,
that's the goal. And hopefully Joe and I keep alluding to this. The specific project I'm alluding to here is we looked at the cattle contract library. Myself, Ted Schroeder, Brian Coffey worked at USDA to try to assess that pilot program, fairly new program. How does it work? Could it be done better? Gave some suggestions to USDA. But that's an example of something that wasn't here. It's a pilot program. It wasn't here 20 years ago. We didn't even have contracts on cattle, the way we do today 30 years ago. So there's a lot of evolution in the cattle space that USDA is kind of keeping up with. Hopefully the project that Ted, Brian, and I, did helps in that. But more broadly, Joe and I sitting here, we've engaged with USDA a lot over time. Hopefully as external analysts coming from a university perspective, not picking winners and losers, just trying to make the system better, are able to help us accomplish that goal better as society.
Yeah, and I'll just compare and contrast here with Glynn. My project was a swine contracts library. I worked on it with Lee Schultz at Iowa State and then Alice Roach here at Kansas State University. And that's a program that's been around for 20 years. We've been collecting data. USDA collects information from companies on what these swine marketing contracts are and then reports out the details at an aggregate level that maintains confidentiality of that. And the real question is, okay, we've been collecting this from 20 years, but can we report it out better?
So how have you seen the changes with the USDA and statistics and data and all of that around the livestock industry?
We kind of got started in this really in wholesale pork. And at one time, USDA, it was a voluntary report. So if there was trade in the wholesale pork market, so if you had butts, if you had loins and so forth, and then it became, okay, maybe there's a bigger need to collect that more consistently. And that actually became a law that it was going to be mandated to collect that information. So, Glynn and I started this by saying, okay, if they're going to mandate it, what's best for the packers? What's best for the producers? What should this look like? I still remember that, one of the things that to me amazed me was, at least at the wholesale level, this is from a packer or a processor into the retailer, there's over 30,000 different SKUs that come from one hog.
And that's not a dated statistic.
Yeah.
There'd be even more today.
More today. But somehow, USDA is tasked with collecting all these 30,000 different products that come out of this hog and then bringing it back to a representative hog that we can tie back to give information between the producers and the processors and policymakers ultimately.
Are we seeing changes in USDA reports?
The reality over time is, budgets evolve, and USDA has to make decisions about how to make best use of the resources that they are allocated. This is Glynn's hope, is that periodically we do reviews, kind of like we're talking about here, how to make specific products better, is what we were alluding to so far. But even backing up one level and say, is USDA, and more generally the public, right? USDA is just the mechanism we're talking about here, the agency, collecting the right stuff, meeting the need of information sharing for the public. Some things probably don't have the same value today that they did 30 years ago. Or maybe we can do it in a little different way that's more efficient than it was 30 years ago. And yet there's probably some other things that maybe we aren't tracking that are very relevant in current commerce that we should be. So there's this evolution that needs to occur. It does occur in the private industry, that periodically pausing and saying, is in this case USDA kind of approaching that right? And sometimes budget constraints force those decisions. There's a lot of discussion around that right now, is why I'm interjecting that. I would hope that these periodic evaluations would help us to discover more efficient ways, and the reports and the outputs more generally that are of most value, that would be kind of protected the most when we have to shrink because of budgets. And the opposite of that is reveal the things that maybe we could shrink because of budget realities.
Following up on Glynn's comment there, is the realities is we get fewer and fewer farms. We get into issues where, we're seeing more and more that USDA can't report, because it gets into that confidentiality. Maybe there's one apple orchard in a particular county, and we can't report that out because that would divulge specific information about that. The other thing, even on a broader scale, that Glynn and I really spend a lot of time is everybody wants transparency out there. Producers, industry wants transparency. But with transparency becomes some unintended consequences. And we have to really be careful that we're not disclosing information out there that might lead to collusive activities from that information. So we have to balance that transparency with not opening up a Pandora's box there of giving away information that not intentionally, but used unintentionally to create a uncomfortable situation for folks in the marketplace.
And Shelby, my last add-on to that is some of the most quote-unquote successful USD outputs are heavily used and used in ways that I'm not sure were expected to be used that way. So there's examples we could give that, 30 years ago, a USDA report didn't exist. It came about, and it became the base in a formula relationship for some commodity in the future. As an analyst here, I don't think that's wrong. It's actually a testament of the quality of that product that those doing business trusted enough to do business around it. But it may not have been envisioned when that report was built that's what would have occurred. So I give that as an example of an unintended consequence of this exercise. Doesn't mean it's bad at all. Actually, if both the buyers and sellers see value in that, that was of value to the private sector when that occurred. But these reports get used in lots of different ways, and we can't always forecast how they're going to be used, is why I interject that right there. And to me, it just doubles down on the value of these periodic evaluations to hopefully say, are we doing them, quote unquote, the right way, keeping up with the real world, private interest? And when we have budget constraints, is there a way we could do that better?
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor, and he was joined by the director of the Center for Risk Management at K-State, Joe Parcell. I will link the swine contract library and cattle contract library in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we end today's show with Brad White, Bob Larson, and Eduarda Bortoluzzi from the Beef Cattle Institute.
When I get in my typical commercial beef cow-calf herd, I get a set of twins. Give me some base things that I might need to think about right from the start.
So it's actually more common than we think to have twins in beef cattle. We just don't talk about it as much. But I think one of the important things is just making sure they're healthy. They're going to be way smaller than our singleton calves. So they might require us to keep them closer and keep an eye on them, making sure that they got colostrum from their mom. And if they didn't, maybe milk some other cow that we can get colostrum from. And then the normal procedure, I would say, that the beef herds do is just grafting or giving that calf to another cow that lost her calf or for some reason doesn't have her calf with her anymore. So that's one thing, and we do that to ensure that they will get a good nutrition in herds, like I did for research, we actually had a herd of twin calves, so they all stayed together. So all the cows would stay together, and then some of those we grafted and some of those we kept with their dam. But the main behavior that we saw is just that they cross-suckle a lot. So that, I think, also influences how good they perform later.
Yeah, absolutely. So if the cows will allow cross-suckling, which maybe once she's got two, she's like, hey,
yeah.
no.
It's too many to keep track.
Too many to keep track of. So when we think about those, Bob, what would tell me when I need to maybe intervene or do something different?
First of all, early is probably the most important, the critical time. Making sure those calves have the opportunity to get colostrum. Make sure that they're getting some milk, because I'm really quite concerned about them just not getting enough nutrition early on. Probably separate out the dam and her twins so that they can be monitored and make sure that both calves are thriving. And so it's a little bit subjective, but thriving means that he should act like a normal calf. He should be out playing. He should just have the behavior of a normal calf. And I'm concerned that he's not getting enough calories. So he's probably, if that's the case, he's probably laying down more. He's not acting as vigorous as a normal calf. He might have his head up and stuff, but he's just not quite behaving like a normal calf. In which case, I may have to try to graft him onto another cow or just wean him and hand feed him. But basically, my biggest concern is just flat out not enough calories. And it may be because, of the twins, they're not exact. A lot of times they're not the same size. One's a little more rigorous than the other. And the one that's kind of falling behind, or maybe the dam prefers one. There's several reasons why one might fall behind. And when I have twins, that's what I'm concerned about.
You just really, that first few days, you got to keep an eye on them. Because when you mention thriving or not, because at certain times of day, you'll go out and those calves will be flat out on their side and sleep, and that's normal. But they got to be able to hop up and make sure, especially if I've got twins, because it's easy to, he seems like he's doing okay, and then all of a sudden he is flat out. Because they don't have the energy reserves to last a very, very long. So, Eduarda, any other tips that you'd give us?
I would say that one easy thing to do is if you want to keep your cow that has twins with your heifer herd, that is nice because you're going to keep an eye on your heifer herd a lot more than you would on your cow herd. So you can check on those calves a lot more often and make sure they are eating properly and they are in good health. So I think that is just a strategy that is fairly easy to do. And then the second thing I would say is just sometimes we don't see positive outcome because the calf we grafted is usually the smallest. So it's one that is already not thriving. And then we also graft into another cow that it's not its mom, and then it takes some time for them to build their connection. So we don't see them thriving because of that.
Yeah, so the grafted calves may not work as well. Sometimes people will wean them and bottle feed them, but not everybody likes or has time to do that because that's a serious time commitment when we take on those calves. And I think that's an opportunity when you get those calves, be sure that we're out there observing them early. He may cross-suckle on his own or not, but you have to make sure that he's getting that nutrition.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.